Maren found Phoebe sleeping in the dirt. Not on dirt. In it. The girl had crawled into the shallow cut Seth had made in the hillside, maybe 4 feet deep, barely taller than a man kneeling, and she'd curled up against the back wall of exposed earth and fallen asleep. Her cheek was pressed against the soil. Her hands were tucked under her body. She was breathing slowly, deeply, the way children breathe when they're truly comfortable, and Maren hadn't seen Phoebe breathe like that in 6 weeks. Maren dropped to her knees at the edge of the excavation. Her first thought was that something was wrong. A child sleeping in a hole in a hillside in October in Minnesota was not a child who was fine. She reached for Phoebe's forehead, expecting cold skin, expecting the papery chill that had become normal on her daughter's face since the temperature dropped. Warm. Phoebe's skin was warm, not feverish. Warm the way a child is supposed to be warm. Blood moving, color in the cheeks, heat radiating from the body instead of being sucked out of it. Maren pressed her hand against Phoebe's neck. Warm. She pressed her hand against the earth wall where Phoebe's cheek had been resting. Warm. The soil was warm, not hot, not sun-heated. There was no sun. The sky was iron gray and the air was 34 degrees and the frost was already killing the grass on the surface of the hillside. But 4 feet into the earth, where Seth's pickaxe had opened a wound in the slope, the soil was warm. Maren pressed both palms flat against it. She held them there. The warmth was steady, constant, like pressing your hands against a living thing. Seth. He was 50 yards downhill at the temporary shelter they'd been living in, a sodden canvas lean-to that was barely better than sleeping outside. He'd been working on timber framing, trying to figure out how to build a proper cabin on the hillside that the settlement had assigned them, the hillside that nobody else wanted, the hillside that Dale Prentice had pointed to with a smirk and said, "That's your plot, Caulfield. Good luck building on a grave." Seth looked up when Maren called. He set down the saw and walked to the excavation. He saw Phoebe sleeping against the earth wall, and his face did the same thing Maren's had done. Alarm, then confusion, then something else. "Feel the wall," Maren said. He climbed into the excavation and pressed his hand against the earth. He held it there, his eyes closed. When they opened, something had changed behind them. "It's warm," he said. "I know. The earth is warm. I know, Seth." He pressed harder, as if he could push through the soil and find the source. But there was no source. The warmth wasn't coming from anything. It was the earth itself. 4 feet below the surface, below the frost line, the ground maintained its own temperature. Somewhere around 50 degrees year-round, winter and summer, regardless of what the air above was doing. The frozen surface was a skin. Beneath it, the earth was warm. Seth looked at his daughter sleeping peacefully against warm soil, while 30 feet away, in their lean-to, her brother Levi was wrapped in every blanket they owned and still shivering. "Maren," he said, "I've been building the wrong thing." "What do you mean?" "I've been trying to build a cabin on this hillside, framing it up, fighting the slope, trying to make flat ground where there isn't any. That's wrong. I shouldn't be building on the hill. I should be building into it." Maren looked at him. She looked at the excavation. She looked at Phoebe, warm and sleeping. "Tell me what you're thinking," she said. "If I dig into this hillside, deep, maybe 15 feet, and I frame it with timber, and I leave only the front face open for a door and windows, the earth becomes the walls. The earth becomes the roof. The earth becomes the insulation. We'd be living inside the hill. The ground is 50 degrees. Our walls would be 50 degrees. Our ceiling would be 50 degrees. The only cold surface would be the front wall, and I can insulate that with logs and clay. We'd have a home that stays above 50 degrees without burning a single piece of wood." Maren was quiet for a long time. She looked at the excavation again, at the dark brown earth, at the root tendrils hanging from where Seth's pickaxe had cut. She was calculating. Marin always calculated. "How long to dig it?" she said. 3 weeks, maybe 4. I'll need Levi. Can you finish before the hard freeze? If I start tomorrow. Start today. The settlement of Harlan Crossing sat on flat prairie east of the river. 22 families had claimed plots during the summer land rush, and 21 of them had taken flat ground near the water. The flat ground was easy. You felled trees, you notched logs, you raised walls, you had a cabin. The plots went in order of arrival, and the Caulfields had arrived last. What was left was the hillside at the eastern edge of the settlement, a steep, grassy slope that rose 40 feet above the prairie, too steep for easy building, too rocky for easy plowing, too far from the river for easy water. Dale Prentice had been in charge of plot allocation. He was on the settlement council, which meant he had power, and he used it the way powerful men on the frontier often did, to make sure his own family got the best and the latecomers got the rest. When Seth asked about the hillside plot, Dale hadn't even tried to hide his amusement. "That's a hillside, Caulfield, not a home site. You want to build on that, go ahead, but you'll be digging your own grave up there." The word stuck. Within a week, the settlement was calling it the grave. Seth heard it at the general store. Marin heard it at the well. Even Levi came home one afternoon and said, "Pa, the Prentice boys say we live in a graveyard." Seth didn't respond to it. He wasn't a man who responded to words. He responded to problems. And the problem was that his family was about to enter a Minnesota winter in a lean-to that wouldn't survive the first real storm. He'd been planning a conventional cabin, log walls, sod roof, stone chimney. But the hillside made conventional building brutal. The slope meant one wall would need to be twice the height of the other. The ground was uneven. Drainage ran straight through the building site after every rain. He'd been fighting the hill for 3 weeks and losing. Phoebe sleeping in the warm earth changed everything. He started digging the next morning at first light. The plan was simple in concept and enormous in execution. Excavate a chamber 15 feet deep into the hillside, 12 feet wide, 8 feet tall. Frame the ceiling with heavy timber beams spaced 18 inches apart, packed with earth on top. Leave the front face open for a log wall with a door and 2 windows. The back wall, both side walls, and the ceiling would be earth, solid, insulating, warm. Levi worked beside him. The boy was strong for his age, broad-shouldered, quiet, steady. He didn't need to be told what to do next. He watched his father swing the pickaxe and figured out the rhythm within an hour. Seth loosened the earth. Levi shoveled it into a wheelbarrow. Marin hauled the wheelbarrow to the dump pile. They rotated every 2 hours because the work was too brutal for any one position to sustain. The first 3 feet were the hardest. The surface soil was tangled with grass roots and studded with stones, and every swing of the pickaxe sent shockwaves through Seth's shoulders and neck. But as they dug deeper, the earth changed. The roots thinned. The soil became clay, dense, heavy, smooth. It held its shape when cut. It didn't crumble. And it was warm. "Feel that," Seth said to Levi on the second day, pressing the boy's hand against the freshly exposed clay wall. Levi held his hand there. His eyes widened. "It's warm, Pa." 50 degrees, give or take. That clay has been 50 degrees since before we were born. It'll be 50 degrees after we're gone. The sun heats it in summer, and the earth holds it, and it takes months for the cold to penetrate this deep. By the time the frost reaches this layer, spring is already coming and warming it back up. The cold never wins. Not down here. So our walls will be 50 degrees? Our walls, our ceiling, and 3 sides of our floor. 50 degrees without a fire. without a single log burned. The earth does the work. Levi picked up the shovel. Let's dig faster. On the fourth day, Dale Prentice came up the hill. He stood at the edge of the excavation with his hands on his hips and his buffalo coat open to show the new wool vest underneath. Two other settlers, Gideon Hark and a younger man, Seth, didn't know well, stood behind him. They looked at the hole in the hillside, the way you look at something pitiful. "Caulfield, what in God's name are you doing?" Dale said. "Building my home." "In a hole?" "In the hillside." Dale laughed. It was a big, open laugh, loud enough to carry, warm enough to seem friendly, designed to make everyone else laugh too. The younger man behind him did. Gideon Hark did not. "You're digging yourself a root cellar and calling it a house," Dale said. "Your wife and children are going to live in a hole in the ground like animals. That's what you're telling me." "I'm telling you the earth is 50 degrees 4 feet down. My walls will be earth. My ceiling will be earth. My home will be 50 degrees in January, while yours is 38 and burning 8 cords a month." Dale's smile stayed, but something behind his eyes shifted. 50 degrees, he repeated. In a hole. In the hill. "Listen, Caulfield, I came up here as a courtesy. The council's had some talk about what you're doing to this hillside, digging it up, destabilizing the slope. If that hill slides, it slides toward the settlement. That's a problem." "It won't slide. The clay layer is stable. I'm shoring the ceiling with 12-inch timbers spaced 18 inches apart. This will be the most structurally sound building in Harlan Crossing." "The most structurally sound grave," Dale said. He turned to Gideon and the younger man. "You heard him. He's building a grave. When it collapses on his family, nobody say I didn't warn him." He walked back down the hill. The younger man followed. Gideon Hark stayed for a moment, looking at the excavation, looking at the exposed clay walls, looking at Seth. "Is the earth really 50 degrees?" Gideon asked. "Put your hand on it." Gideon climbed into the excavation carefully. He was old, his joints stiff, and pressed his palm against the clay wall. He held it there for a long time. "That's warm," he said. "Yes." "Interesting," Gideon said. He climbed back out. He didn't say anything else. He walked down the hill. By the end of the first week, the chamber was 8 feet deep. Seth could stand inside it, and the earth walls rose above his head. The temperature inside the excavation, even open to the October air, was noticeably warmer than outside. You could feel it as you stepped in. A change, like walking through an invisible door from cold air into something gentler. Maren had started keeping the food stores in the back of the excavation because it was warmer than their lean-to, and the consistent temperature kept the butter from freezing and the bread from going stale. On day 9, the ceiling collapsed. Seth was at the back of the excavation, 10 feet in, working the pickaxe to widen the chamber. Levi was near the front, hauling dirt. Maren was outside at the wheelbarrow. The sound came first, a groan, low and deep. The sound of earth moving against itself, of weight shifting in a direction it had held for 10,000 years. Then, a crack, sharp as a rifle shot, and a section of the ceiling 4 feet wide dropped. Seth threw himself backward. The earth hit the ground where he'd been standing a half-second before. Dirt and clay and small stones cascaded down in a choking cloud. A timber support that he'd placed the day before snapped like a matchstick. The weight was too much, the span too wide, the timber too thin. The collapse filled a third of the chamber in seconds. "Pa!" Levi's voice came from the front, panicked, muffled by the dust. "I'm here! I'm fine! Get out!" Levi scrambled out. Maren was at the edge, her face white. "Seth." "I'm fine! I'm coming!" He climbed over the pile of collapsed earth and out into the daylight. His hands were shaking. His shirt was torn where a stone had grazed his shoulder. He stood in the cold October air and looked at the cave-in and tried to breathe normally. Maren looked at him. She looked at the collapsed ceiling. She didn't say, "I told you so," because she hadn't told him so. She'd supported this from the moment Phoebe fell asleep in warm earth. But her face asked a question. "The timbers were too thin," Seth said, "and the span was too wide. I was trying to save wood. That was stupid. How do you fix it? Heavier timbers, closer together, and I need cross-bracing, horizontal pieces, connecting the vertical supports to the ceiling beams. Like a bridge structure, it needs to hold the weight of the earth above it. How much earth is above it? At 15 feet deep, there'll be about 6 feet of earth on top. That's roughly 200 pounds per square foot. Over a 12 by 15-foot ceiling, that's 36,000 pounds. Maren absorbed that number. 36,000 pounds of earth, above the room where her children would sleep. "Can the timbers hold that?" she said. "If they're thick enough, close enough, and braced properly?" "Yes. I've built barn roofs that hold more than that, in snow load. This is the same engineering. Earth is heavier than snow, but it's also more predictable. It doesn't shift. It doesn't slide. Once it's packed and set, it stays." "You're sure?" "I'm sure, Maren." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Levi, help your father clear the debris. I'm going to the timber stand to find larger logs." "Maren, you can't haul. I can mark the ones you need. You can fell them. Don't waste time arguing." She was right. She was usually right when it came to allocating effort. They lost 3 days to the cave-in, 3 days clearing debris, 3 days felling heavier timber, logs a foot thick that took 2 hours each to bring down, and another hour to drag uphill with ropes and the mule. Seth redesigned the ceiling support system from scratch. Instead of single beams spanning the full width, he used a grid. Beams running both directions, notched where they crossed, creating a lattice that distributed weight across every support point instead of concentrating it on a few. He braced every vertical post with diagonal timbers nailed and pegged into the earth walls. When he was done, the support structure looked like the skeleton of a ship turned upside down. Ribs and crossbeams and braces everywhere, more wood in the ceiling than most cabins had in their entire walls. "That's a lot of timber for a grave," Maren said, and Seth looked at her and saw the half smile and understood that she was using the word to take the poison out of it, the way you handle a thorn by grabbing it at the base. "Best built grave in Minnesota," he said. "Best built grave in any state." They finished the excavation at the end of the 3rd week. The chamber was 15 feet deep, 12 feet wide, 8 feet tall. 3 walls and the ceiling were packed earth, smooth, dense clay that Seth had scraped and shaped until it was almost flat. He'd left exposed sections where the clay was particularly dense and even, and in those places the wall looked almost like plaster, reddish-brown, slightly damp, alive with the earth's own warmth. The floor was packed earth that he'd leveled and tamped until it was hard and smooth. He'd laid flat stones along the heaviest traffic paths, from the door to the hearth, from the hearth to where the beds would be. The front wall was his showcase. He built it from logs, the straightest, most uniform logs he'd cut all autumn, notched and fitted with a precision that came from years of carpentry. He set the door in the center, framed with squared timber. He cut 2 windows, each 18 inches square, and Maren fitted them with glass she'd brought from their previous home, wrapped in cloth in the bottom of a trunk for 900 miles. The glass went in, and suddenly the chamber wasn't a hole in a hillside. It was a room. It was a home with windows that let in the gray October light and showed the prairie stretching out below, and the settlement's cabins scattered across it like toys. He built the hearth against the left earth wall. Not a large hearth. He didn't need a large hearth. The earth walls were already 50 degrees. He only needed the fire to bring the temperature up another 10 or 15 degrees to make the space comfortable. A small hearth, burning small fires, consuming a fraction of the wood that conventional cabins required. He lined the hearth with stones and built a clay chimney that angled upward through the earth ceiling and out the top of the hillside. From the settlement below, the chimney was almost invisible, just a thin clay pipe poking out of the grassy slope. They moved in on November 2nd. The lean-to had gotten them through October, barely. The nights had been dipping into the 20s, and the canvas walls might as well have been paper. Phoebe's cough had come back. Levi was sleeping with his boots on. Maren hadn't taken off her shawl in 9 days. The first step through the door of the earth-sheltered cabin changed everything. The temperature inside was 51 degrees. No fire had been lit. No stove was burning. The earth walls were radiating their heat into the room the way they'd been radiating it for millennia, steady and constant and indifferent to the weather outside. 51 degrees. That was warmer than every cabin in Harlan Crossing, and most of those cabins had been burning wood for weeks. Phoebe walked in and stopped. She stood in the middle of the room and turned in a slow circle, looking at the earth walls, the timber ceiling, the stone floor, the windows. Then she sat down on the packed earth floor and pulled off her boots. "What are you doing?" Maren said. "The floor is warm, Mama." Maren knelt and pressed her palm to the packed earth. Warm. The earth floor was warm because the earth beneath it was warm, because the earth around it was warm, because every surface in the room was earth, and every surface was warm. They were inside the hill. The hill was warm. They were warm. "Seth?" Maren said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were not. "I know. It's November 2nd, and I'm not cold." "I know." She stood up and walked the length of the room, pressing her hand against each wall. Back wall, warm. Left wall, warm. Right wall, warm. She reached up and pressed her hand against the timber ceiling, which had 6 feet of earth above it. Warm. She came back to the center of the room and stood there with her arms at her sides and her eyes closed. "We're going to be fine," she said. Not a question. A decision. Seth lit the first fire that evening, a small fire, 3 logs, barely enough to fill a conventional stove. Within an hour, the temperature in the cabin had risen to 58 degrees. The earth walls absorbed the heat from the fire and held it, and when the fire burned down to coals, the walls continued to radiate that absorbed heat back into the room. The temperature dropped slowly, 1 degree per hour, instead of the 5 or 6 degrees per hour that conventional cabins lost when the fire died. By morning, after 8 hours without adding wood, the cabin was still 53 degrees. Maren started keeping records. She wrote the temperature on a slate board every 4 hours. She noted the wood burned, the weather outside, the wind direction. She was building a case, though she didn't say that out loud. She was collecting evidence. The first real cold came on November 19th. The temperature dropped to 8 degrees overnight. Maren recorded it on the slate. Inside the cabin, 54 degrees with a small fire burning. She recorded that too. At the general store 3 days later, Ida Voss asked Maren how they were managing in the grave. Maren said, 54 degrees. How are you managing, Ida? Ida blinked. 54. We're at 40 with the stove running all day and night. We burn 3 logs a day. 3 logs. Ida repeated it as if testing whether the words had been arranged correctly. 3 logs. The earth does the rest. Ida looked at Maren for a long time. Then she looked away and said, "Well, Dale says it'll collapse by January." "Dale says a lot of things," Maren replied. December came hard. The temperature dropped below 0 on the 3rd, and didn't come back above it for 11 days. The settlement burned through wood at a terrifying rate. Every family was feeding their stoves continuously, 6, 8, 10 logs a day, and their cabins hovered between 35 and 42 degrees. Children slept in their coats. Women cooked in their gloves. The sound of axe blows carried through the frozen air from dawn to dusk as men split more wood, always more wood, always feeding the stoves that devoured fuel and returned a fraction of its heat. The Caulfield cabin was 52 degrees. Seth had added a second layer of insulation to the front wall, a false wall of planks with dried grass packed between the inner and outer layers. The front wall had been the weak point, the one surface not surrounded by earth, and the grass insulation cut the heat loss through it by more than half. With that improvement, the cabin held above 50 degrees even on the coldest nights, with the fire banked down to barely glowing coals. Phoebe's cough disappeared. Levi stopped sleeping in his boots. Marin took off her shawl. One night in the second week of December, Seth woke at 3 a.m. The fire had gone out completely. The coals were dark, the hearth cold to the touch. He lay in bed and listened. Wind was hammering the front wall, finding the gaps around the doorframe, hissing through the cracks. He could hear the timber creaking under the pressure, but the earth walls, the back wall, the side walls, the ceiling, were silent. They didn't flex. They didn't creak. They didn't let anything through. He pressed his hand against the earth wall beside the bed. Warm, still warm, always warm. The fire had been dead for hours, and the cabin was 49 degrees. In any conventional cabin with the fire dead for that long on a night this cold, the temperature would have dropped to 30 or lower. Here, the earth held the warmth like a body holds blood, deep inside, protected, refusing to let go. He didn't relight the fire. He lay back down and pulled the blanket up and listened to his family breathing in a home that stayed warm by itself. And he slept better than he had in years. These details might sound small. They weren't. On the frontier in 1890s, Minnesota, a child without a cough was a child who would survive the winter. A boy sleeping without boots was a boy whose feet weren't at risk of frostbite. A woman without a shawl was a woman whose body wasn't spending every calorie it consumed fighting to stay warm. These were the details that separated living from surviving and surviving from dying. Dale Prentice came up the hill on December 15th. He didn't bring anyone this time. He came alone, late in the afternoon, when the sun was already gone and the sky was that deep blue black that precedes the truly cold nights. He knocked on the door. Seth opened it. The warm air rushed out and the cold rushed in, and Dale stood in the doorway with frost on his sideburns and his buffalo coat buttoned to the neck, and an expression on his face that Seth had never seen before. It wasn't contempt. It wasn't amusement. It was something that looked from certain angles like fear. "Can I come in?" Dale said. Seth stepped aside. Dale walked into the cabin and stopped moving. He stood just inside the doorway, the same way visitors always stopped. The warmth hit them like walking into a different season, and their bodies needed a moment to register that this was real. "How?" Dale said. "The earth," Seth said. "The walls are earth, the ceiling is earth, 3 sides and the top, 50 degrees year-round. I just need a small fire to bring it up a few degrees more." "How much wood are you burning?" 3 logs a day." Dale was silent. He looked at the earth walls. He looked at the timber ceiling. He looked at Phoebe, who was sitting on the floor, drawing pictures with charcoal on a piece of brown paper. He looked at Levi, who was reading by candlelight with his sleeves rolled up, in December, while Dale's own children were sleeping in double coats and wool caps. "My chimney cracked," Dale said. "What?" "My chimney cracked. The mortar froze and expanded, and the chimney cracked from the roof line down. I can't run the stove without filling the cabin with smoke. I've been trying to patch it for 3 days. The mortar won't set in this cold. It freezes before it cures." Seth waited. "Lorna and the children have been in the barn with the animals for 2 nights. It's warmer in there than the cabin without the stove, but it's still below freezing. The baby—" Dale stopped. His jaw worked. "The baby isn't doing well." "Bring them here," Seth said. Dale looked at him. "Bring Lorna and the children here, tonight. They can stay until your chimney is fixed." "I didn't come here to ask for—" "I know what you didn't come here to ask for. I'm telling you. Bring them here tonight. It's going to be 15 below by midnight." Dale stood in the warm cabin, and the muscles in his face moved through several expressions before settling on one that Seth had never seen on Dale Prentice: gratitude being wrestled into submission by pride and losing. "I'll bring them within the hour," Dale said. He was back in 40 minutes. Lorna came through the door, carrying the baby wrapped in 3 blankets and a sheepskin. The baby was silent, too silent, the way Phoebe had been too still when she'd stopped shivering in October. Behind Lorna, 3 children between the ages of 4 and 10 pushed through the doorway, their faces raw with cold, their eyes huge in the lamplight. Lorna stopped inside the door. She looked at the earth walls. She looked at the timber ceiling. She looked at the floor. She held the baby against her chest and her chin trembled. "It's warm," she said. The words came out broken, split by something she'd been holding in. Maren was already moving. She took the baby from Lorna's arms, gently, firmly, the way women on the frontier transfer children during emergencies without asking permission because the need is obvious, and brought the baby near the hearth. She unwrapped the outer blanket and the sheepskin and pressed her hand against the baby's chest. "Seth, heat some water. Not hot, warm, body temperature. Maren, is the baby—" "The baby is cold, not too far gone. We need to warm her slowly. Warm water on cloths against the chest and under the arms. Slowly. Don't rush it." Seth heated water. Maren soaked cloths and pressed them against the baby's skin. Phoebe helped without being asked. She took the Prentice children to the back of the cabin where the earth wall was warmest and sat them down on the floor and told them to take off their boots. "But it's freezing," the oldest Prentice boy said. "No, it isn't," Phoebe said. "Feel the floor." The boy pulled off his boots. He pressed his feet against the packed earth. His face changed. "It's warm," he said. The same words, spoken with the same surprise, that everyone who entered this cabin said eventually. "It's always warm," Phoebe said. Lorna was crying. She was standing in the middle of the cabin, watching Maren warm her baby, and she was crying without sound, the way frontier women cry, silently, because there were years of practice at not being heard. Dale stood near the door with his arms rigid at his sides, watching his wife cry, watching his children warm themselves on an earth floor, watching the baby he'd been unable to protect being saved by the family whose home he'd called a grave. "Seth," Dale said. "Don't," Seth said. "I need to—" "You don't need to say anything. Your family is cold. We have room. That's all that matters tonight." Dale's mouth closed. He nodded once. He looked at the earth walls again, and this time, what was behind his eyes wasn't fear or pride or gratitude. It was understanding. He was a builder. He understood structures. And he was looking at these walls and finally seeing them, not as a grave, not as a hole, but as insulation, as engineering, as the simplest and most profound heating system he'd ever encountered. The Prentice family stayed 3 days. On the first night, the baby's color came back. On the second day, Lorna walked barefoot across the earth floor, barefoot in December, and stood by the window looking out at the frozen prairie below, and said to Maren, I didn't know a home could feel like this. Like what? Marin said. Safe. I didn't know a home could feel safe in winter. Every winter since we came to Minnesota, I've been afraid. Every single night. Afraid the fire would die. Afraid the children would get sick. Afraid I'd wake up and someone would be cold and still. I haven't been afraid since I walked through your door. Marin put her hand on Lorna's arm. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that the warm earth walls weren't already saying. On the third day, Dale fixed his chimney. Seth lent him a technique for cold weather mortar using ash and clay that would set even below freezing. Before he left, Dale stood outside the cabin's front wall and looked at the hillside and the structure buried inside it. I need to ask you something, Dale said. Go ahead. Can I build one? Anybody can build one. You need a hillside, timber for the ceiling and front wall, and the willingness to dig. I don't have a hillside. Seth looked at him. You have the north slope behind your barn. Dale looked down the hill toward his own property. Behind his barn, there was indeed a gentle slope, not as steep as the Caulfield hillside, but enough. Enough to dig into. Enough to bury 3 walls and a ceiling. I'll need help, Dale said, with the ceiling structure. After the cave-in you had, I heard about it. I want to make sure I get the bracing right. I'll help you. After what? I said about your... Dale. It's cold and your family needs to be warm. I'll help you. Dale extended his hand. Seth shook it. It was the first time they'd touched since the Caulfields arrived in Harlan Crossing, and the handshake carried the weight of everything Dale wasn't able to say and everything Seth didn't need to hear. Word spread the way things spread in small settlements, not through announcements, but through silence. People noticed that the Prentice family had spent 3 nights in the Caulfield cabin. People noticed that Lorna had walked barefoot on an earth floor in December. People noticed that the Caulfield chimney barely smoked, while every other chimney in the settlement poured out clouds of burning wood. Ida Voss came first. She knocked on the door on a Tuesday morning and said, Marin, I want to feel the wall. Marin let her in. Ida pressed her palm against the earth wall and held it there, her eyes closed. When they opened, they were wet. 50 degrees? Ida said. 52 today. Marin, my house is 37 degrees and we're burning everything we have. My husband cut 12 cords before October and we've already used 7. We won't make it to March. We won't have enough wood. Talk to Seth, Marin said. He'll show you how to build it. Gideon Hark came next. The old man had said little during the autumn. He'd watched from a distance, noted the cave-in, noted the repair, noted the chimney that barely smoked. He walked up the hill slowly, his joints stiff in the cold, and Seth met him at the door. I've been watching your chimney, Gideon said. Not much to watch. That's the point. Everyone else's chimney is working overtime. Yours is barely there. I've been counting the days without significant smoke. 31 days, Caulfield. 31 days where your chimney produced less smoke than my stove produces in an hour. The earth heats the cabin. The fire is supplemental. I know. I felt the wall in October. I've been thinking about it since then. I should have come sooner. You're here now. I'm here to tell you that you've solved the problem this settlement has had since its founding. Every winter we lose wood. We lose livestock. We lose time. Last year we lost the Denham girl, pneumonia. She was 6. Her cabin was 34 degrees and her body couldn't fight the infection. The room was quiet. Phoebe had stopped drawing. Levi had looked up from his work. Marin stood by the hearth with a cup of tea she'd forgotten to drink. Every family in Harlan Crossing needs what you've built, Gideon said. Every single one. Whether they have a hillside or a slope or a shallow bank to dig into. I want to bring the settlement together. I want you to explain what you've done and why it works. I want you to teach them. I'm not a teacher, Seth said. You're a man who dug into a hillside because his daughter was cold, and now his daughter is warm, and everyone else's children are freezing. That's better than a teacher. That's someone people will listen to." Seth looked at Marin. She gave him a look that said, "You know the answer." "When?" Seth said. "Sunday after meeting. I'll tell everyone to come." "At the meeting hall?" "No, here. They need to feel it. They need to walk through your door and feel the change. Then they'll understand." They came on Sunday. All of them. 21 families walking up the hillside in a single procession, their breath making a cloud that hung in the still January air. Seth stood at the door and watched them come, men and women and children, bundled in every piece of clothing they owned, their faces raw and tired. Dale Prentice was among them. He walked near the back, his buffalo coat buttoned to the neck, and he didn't look at anyone. Lorna walked beside him with the baby wrapped against her chest. They couldn't all fit inside. Seth had Levi and Marin manage the flow, groups of 4 or 5 at a time, through the door, into the warmth. 3 minutes to feel the walls and the floor and the temperature, then out again to let the next group in. Each group did the same thing. They stepped through the door and they stopped. They felt the warmth. They pressed their hands against the earth walls. They looked at each other with the same expression. Surprise becoming understanding, becoming something that looked a lot like hope. When the last group had cycled through, Seth stood outside with the full settlement gathered on the hillside. "I know what you've been calling this place," he said. "The grave. Dale named it that when he gave me this plot, and the name stuck. I didn't mind. Call it whatever you want. But what's inside that grave matters more than what you call it. The earth, 4 feet down, is 50 degrees. Summer and winter. No fire needed, no wood burned. If you build into a hillside, or a slope, or a bank, or even a shallow rise, the earth becomes your walls, and your ceiling, and your insulation. It holds heat the way a lake holds water. Slowly, deeply, constantly. My cabin hasn't dropped below 50 degrees since we moved in. My family is warm. My daughter's cough is gone. My son sleeps without boots. My wife took her shawl off in November and hasn't put it back on." He paused. Marin was watching from the doorway. "I'll help every family here build one. Free, no charge, no trade, no favors. I'll show you how to select a site, how to dig, how to frame the ceiling so it holds, how to build the front wall, how to run a chimney through the earth. The materials are dirt and timber and time. That's all." The settlement was quiet. Frost hung in the air. Children fidgeted. Then Ida Voss spoke. "My husband and I would like to start next week." "So would we," said a man Seth didn't know well, one of the newer families. "Us too," said another voice, and another, and another. Dale Prentice didn't speak publicly, but after the meeting, when the settlement had dispersed and Seth was closing the cabin door against the cold, Dale came back up the hill alone. "You could have shamed me," Dale said. "What would that accomplish?" "You could have told them I called it a grave. You could have told them I gave you the worst plot on purpose. You could have made me look like a fool." "Everyone already knows, Dale." Dale looked at the ground. "I want to start digging tomorrow. Behind the barn, will you help?" "I said I would." "Even after? I don't care about after. I care about your children being warm. Are you going to keep standing in the cold, or are you going to bring me your site dimensions?" Dale almost smiled. Almost. Then he turned and walked down the hill. By February, 4 families had earth-sheltered cabins. By March, when the thaw began softening the surface soil, enough for easier digging, 8 more families were excavating. Seth spent his days moving between sites, marking dimensions, advising on timber spacing, inspecting ceiling bracing, teaching the cold weather mortar technique for chimney installation. Levi became his second set of hands. and the boy understood the engineering so deeply that he could manage a site on his own, answering questions, solving problems, adjusting plans to fit each family's hillside or slope. Marin kept records for every cabin, temperature logs, wood consumption, family size, site dimensions, earth composition. She filled 3 notebooks. The numbers were consistent across every installation. Earth-sheltered cabins maintain temperatures between 48 and 54 degrees without fire, burning less than 1/5 the wood of conventional cabins. Over a 5-month winter, each family saved between 4 and 6 cords of wood. Wood that represented weeks of labor, dollars of income, and hours of warmth that had previously gone up the chimney and into the sky. But it was what happened the following October that convinced Seth the system was more than a solution. It was a way of living. As the first frost came, the families who'd built earth-sheltered cabins the previous spring were already settled. No scramble for firewood, no patching of drafty walls, no fear of the coming cold. They walked into their hillside homes and the earth was waiting for them, warm and constant, unchanged by the summer heat or the autumn cooling, 50 degrees, as it had been and would be. The families who hadn't built yet came to Seth with urgency now, and he organized work crews, 3 families helping a 4th dig and frame, then rotating. The settlement transformed. Where it had been a collection of isolated cabins fighting the cold alone, it became a community built into the landscape, working with the earth instead of against it. The hillsides and slopes that had been considered worthless became the most valuable land in Harlan Crossing. Gideon Hark wrote about it in his journal. Seth never saw the entry, but years later, Gideon's granddaughter shared it with the County Historical Society. The entry, dated November 14th, read, "The settlement has changed in a way I did not anticipate. The Caulfield method, building into the earth rather than upon it, has made our winters livable for the first time. The sound of axes splitting wood, which used to fill every daylight hour from November to March, has diminished to near silence. Families that spent every waking moment feeding fires now have time to mend, time to teach their children, time to rest. The cold is still outside. But it is no longer inside. That difference is everything. Seth never stopped improving the design. That second winter, he experimented with a ventilation system, a clay pipe running from the back of the cabin through the earth ceiling and up through the hillside, drawing fresh air from outside and warming it as it passed through the earth before it entered the living space. The air came in at nearly 50 degrees instead of 0. Clean air, warm air, without opening a door or losing heat. He added a drainage channel along the base of the back wall, a shallow trench lined with stones that captured any moisture seeping through the earth, and directed it out through a pipe under the front wall. The cabins stayed dry. The earth walls never wept. The timber never rotted. Phoebe grew 3 inches that winter. She spent her evenings drawing by candlelight at the table, her feet bare on the warm earth floor, the charcoal stick moving in long, confident strokes. She drew the settlement from above, the hillsides with their hidden homes, the thin wisps of chimney smoke, the prairie stretching flat and white below. She drew her father inside the earth, on his knees, his hands on the clay wall, his face lit by lantern light. She drew her mother at the table with her pencil behind her ear, and 3 notebooks open, columns of numbers proving what the body already knew, that they were warm, that they would stay warm, that the earth had been waiting to give them this all along. Levi, who had spent months watching his father dig and frame and brace and solve, started drawing his own plans, not for a cabin, for a root cellar that used the same principles but focused on food storage, maintaining the earth's constant temperature to keep vegetables through the winter without canning or salt. He showed the drawings to Seth one evening after dinner. This would work, Seth said, turning the paper. I know, Levi said. Then catching himself, I think so. No, you were right the first time. It would work. Build it in the spring. Maren looked up from her notebook. She looked at Levi's drawings. She looked at Seth. And she smiled. Not the half smile she wore when she was being practical, but a real one, a full one. The smile of a woman who had followed her husband into a hole in a hillside and found a home. The following spring, the settlement's children were the first to name it. They stopped calling it the grave. The Prentice boys, the same ones who told Levi his family lived in a graveyard, started calling the earth-sheltered cabins warm houses. The name spread the way the old name had spread, not through decision but through repetition, until nobody remembered calling them anything else. Dale Prentice never apologized. Not directly. But that April, when the ground softened and new families were arriving in the area looking for plots, Dale was the one who walked them up the hillside. Dale was the one who pressed their hands against the earth wall and said, "Feel that. 50 degrees. Summer and winter. The man who figured this out lives right there." He'd point to the Caulfield cabin, its front face emerging from the hillside, glass windows catching the morning light. A thin trace of smoke from the chimney that barely worked because it barely needed to. Maren's final notebook entry for that winter, dated March 21st, read, "Temperature at 6 a.m., 53 degrees. Wood burned yesterday, 2 small logs. Phoebe drew the cabin again today. This time she drew it from the side, so you can see the earth surrounding it. She drew arrows showing the heat moving from the earth into the walls. She's understanding it now. She understands that it works, and she's starting to understand why. She asked me tonight how deep you'd have to dig before the earth stopped being warm. I told her I didn't know. She said she wants to find out." Seth read the entry that evening. He sat at the table and read it twice. Then he looked at Phoebe, who was already asleep on the warm earth floor near the hearth, one hand curled under her chin, the other resting flat against the ground, as if even in sleep she was holding on to the warmth that had saved her. He looked at Maren. She was watching him read. "She's going to dig deeper than I did," he said. "Probably," Maren said. "Good." He closed the notebook and set it on the shelf beside the other 2. 3 notebooks. 1 winter. The beginning of something that would outlast all of them. Outside, the last of the March snow was melting on the hillside above their heads, dripping down through the earth, through the clay, down past the ceiling beams and the cross bracing, into the drainage channel he'd built, out through the pipe, and onto the prairie below. The earth was doing what it had always done, absorbing, holding, releasing, cycling. It had been doing it for 10,000 years before Seth Caulfield put his hand on a warm clay wall and understood. It would keep doing it for 10,000 years after. The floor was warm, the walls were warm, the ceiling was warm, and in the cabin that everyone had called a grave, his family was alive and growing and building things he hadn't imagined yet.